Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to the Thinking Cap podcast. I'm Jack Timperley, and we've got quite the episode for you today. We're going to be talking about technology and how it is affecting our daily lives. Are we ready for some of the changes that are occurring in today's technological advancements? Were we ever ready for it? Let's think about this. So, my name is Jack Timperley, and we have a new member of the Thinking Cap podcast team that I want to introduce first and foremost. Welcome to Sir Jake Eleanor. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Jack, thank you so much for having me. Hi, everybody. It's Jake Allnar here, and I've known Jack for many, many years, going back to our days at Oakton Community College. We worked together at the school newspaper, The Occurrence, and we've done a couple of projects together, creatively. And yeah, I mean, it's a pleasure to be teaming up with you, Jack, and I can't wait for this new venture. And hey, I look, I can't say it enough to our audience. Like the work ethic that Jack puts out, it's just tremendous. And yeah, just looking forward to joining the team here, bud.
Thank you, man. So happy to have you joining us. I'm really looking forward to be working with you and growing the podcast, getting some quality content to you all. And so, without further ado, let's start with our next sponsor, our first sponsor of the episode. It's going to be Riverside. That is the software that we are using to deliver this excellent podcast to you. Riverside is a platform that allows you to stream and record your podcasts, or it's an alternative to Zoom if you like just recording videos or content that you are uploading to YouTube, social media, etc. I personally use it for my own videos and content at times, and of course, I'm using it for Thinking Cat Podcast. Very reasonable rates, very easy to work with, so make sure you click the link in the description if you're on video for Riverside to join. So we are on video platforms such as YouTube, Facebook will be on eventually, LinkedIn, and we're going to get this episode up on Rumble as well. We've got podcast audio platforms such as Spotify, Apple, and Google Podcasts in the house. Welcome to all of you listeners on audio. And this is the moment you've all been waiting for. Get on your thinking caps. Well, today we're going to start thinking about technology in some interesting ways and thinking about the uses that we are already taking upon with new technologies, such as ChatGPT. So let's think about this. When ChatGPT was released not too long ago, what are people using it for? They're using it for plagiarizing. They're using it to make money. They're using it for blogging, and they're using it for tasks that we don't want to do, but and so we're letting artificial intelligence take over and do the work that we don't want to do. Is that the kind of world that we want to live in going forward? Because let's think about this. New technologies like ChatGPT, VR, AR, even social media as it became popular, were we ready for those technologies? We really weren't, because when new technologies are released, they are automatically used for not necessarily their intended purpose, but for personal gain, for personal satisfaction. For example, you go onto VR platforms, maybe not for conferencing for the everyday user or for creating your own worlds, but you go on there, why? To socialize, just like you would in the real world. You might use artificial intelligence to increase your workflow, which is great and should be used for workflow more often, and especially in industries like the medical industry could really use AR, and engineering design could really use AR. But for the average user, at least in 2023, we aren't quite ready to integrate that into our lives because we don't know how to. And that's the other thing to think about is we don't necessarily know what to do with the technology that we create when we create it. Why do we create? Well, humans have been innovating and creating new technologies to improve our everyday lives since dawn of civilization. You might not think of agriculture as technology, but that was an innovation. It was a technological innovation. Not necessarily what you would think of today, like a mobile phone or a new computer, but it was an innovation that was meant to improve our collective lives, the collective lives of the society or culture at hand. And that's not something they were necessarily prepared for, but when it came, they they used it the only ways that they knew how and the ways that they saw that they could benefit from them at the time. Let's think about history as well. We've got when radio was replaced by the TV set, that killed the radio star, right? And yet, new jobs were created in spite of that. And when mobile phones came into play, social media started emerging, and people stopped. They started using the phones for more productive means and veered less towards TV on a day-to-day basis. They still might watch TV. I still watch TV in the evenings, especially after a hard day's work. But I'm on my phone for most of the day. without, without the phone, well, what people used to do without mobile smartphones, they waited for somebody to call the landline, and if nobody called the landline, what would they do? They would play poker. They would interact with people. They would interact with the world. And so, before the emergence of social media and mobile phones, people wanted to socialize. People wanted to interact. They wanted things to do. And so now you look at people in a room sometimes. It's very interesting. Gary V, if you know who that is, actually addressed this at one point in one of his podcasts. And it's the idea that before mobile phones, okay, two people are at dinner and they're looking at the floor. They're not talking. Humans weren't necessarily made to talk to each other and interact with each other all the time, right? So without the mobile phones, they're just staring at each other, looking at the floor, looking all around, in silence. But now with the mobile phones, they're on their phones. Today we look at two people on a date at dinner, looking at their phones, like, God, they're not interacting. That's so sad. That's probably not going to work out. But thank goodness they have those phones because they're not necessarily going to be talking every single second most of the time. Sure, I would hope that people will have more drive and opportunities to socialize and interact with each other in the real world. But mobile phones gave people something to do. Our minds are constantly occupied. Our minds are constantly thinking, and that's one of the reasons we started this podcast. Is we've got about 70,000 thoughts every day, and we don't. How many of those do we actually entertain and think about deeply? Very little. Only the ones that matter to us in the moment. Like, oh, I wonder what I'm going to eat for dinner today or tomorrow. Oh, I wonder what next week is going to look like. Oh, I wonder if they're going to have this at the store. Our brains are constantly working. Why do you think we take our phones to the bathroom? We didn't used to do that, but thank goodness we have it now because it gives us something to do. It gives our brains something to look at and to play with and to think about, even if it's mindless thinking in a way. If you're playing games or just scrolling through social media, it's not necessarily a bad thing. And so we're using these technologies because we're not necessarily ready for all the potential that it has, for better or for worse, but we are ready to use it for how we see fit. And on a personal level, it it's not necessarily a bad thing if it's used in the right ways. What's the right way to use technology? Well, let's think about this a little bit deeper. Technology should be an aid to humanity. If technology takes over our lives, we're going to talk about this in another podcast, but imagine a world where artificial intelligence, let's just say, took over the workplace. It took over our lives. And so if we're not interacting with the world, if we're not interacting with people, we're just slaves in a way to this technology. How quickly do you think you're going to get bored or lonely? These basic human needs, these basic human desires are going to get sidelined. The drive and motivation in humanity is going to suffer immeasurably. And so, I think as long as we allow these technologies to improve our lives and we are able to self monitor, to self guide in a way, which is very hard for a lot of people, by the way, then maybe technology doesn't have to take over the world, and we don't necessarily have to be ready for new innovations, new technologies. We just have to be mindful of how we're using it and the potential implications for society. For example, let's look at gene editing as well, another technology that in mainstream technology, what you think of first is mobile phones, computers, etc. But even medical technologies like gene editing. I actually just published my honors thesis that I did in college at the university level on my interpretation of quality of life in individuals with genetic diseases. Because I myself was born with a rare genetic disease, and so I wanted to wanted to think about what if we introduce these new gene editing technologies. What does that do? What does that say about our identity as people born with these genetic mutations, these diseases, these edits in the genetic code? If we were to go in and manually edit it, what does that say about us? What does that say about our identity, who we are? And one of the results that one of the conclusions I came to about that is the idea that gene editing can be a very good thing for our long-term medical health. However, it doesn't necessarily, unless we let it, it doesn't necessarily take anything away from our identity. Again, that depends on our theories of identity. If we identify ourselves by our DNA, then it might seem unnatural, or at least that's what people argue, is that, let's say it's God's will that our DNA be unedited. But the counterpoint to that argument is, all right, well, isn't it also God's will to create the gene editing technologies? Otherwise, it wouldn't have been invented. And so it gets into a whole spiral of what should we be doing with these gene editing technologies. We've created it at the baseline to start with to eliminate genetic diseases because we saw it was causing harm. But we need to make sure that that doesn't go too further, because then people start talking about, oh, we have this new technology. Ooh, what else could we do with it? Well, what else should we do with it? Should we be editing newborns without any genetic predispositions or diseases just so that they can have a different eye color? Just so that they can be taller? I'm a 4 foot 8 inch tall man. Sure, I would love to be taller, but it doesn't necessarily matter in the long run. Where does this end? Where does the coulds about technology end? And where does it intersect with the shoulds? I hear some people, in documentaries and social media, people are talking about the should, but the people who are creating technologies are not talking about the should. And I think that can be very problematic. And it's a way to think about technology as, no, we're not ready for new technological advancements, and we never have been, we never will be. But we need to be asking the should question. We need to be asking whether or not we should be using these technologies in various ways. I'm very for all the emergences of these new technologies, proud of technological innovations and entrepreneurship, and it can create a wonderful world for all of us. But I'm concerned about the direction that humanity is going, especially as technology is exponentially innovating and exponentially increasing in the last several decades. And it's going to continue this way. Because again, we saw with ChatGPT, no one was really ready for that. But what are people already doing? They're already using it for personal gain. They're already using it so that they don't have to work. Basically, they're using it so that they don't have to think, or using it so that they don't have to do as much. And that's really too bad. I mean, it really, it can help. For example, I'll use artificial intelligence like ChatGPT to help with YouTube content creation. But I use it because it's a baseline, and the creative work that is going into that video is not necessarily all about the content, because it is about the content, the way that I spin it, the way that I phrase it. It's about the delivery. It's about the delivery of the content. It's about personal stories that you add to it. And so I'm using it as an aid not as a replacement. That's why immediately when ChatGPT was becoming a lot more well known and well used, what did teachers, schools, what did turnitin.com do? They tried to stop it. They knew we've got this new technology that's going to allow students to plagiarize. We need to stop that from happening. And so Turnitin developed software to be able to detect AI and flag it as plagiarism in students' essays. And I've talked about this in another video. I'll link to it in the description for those of you on video again. But in order to address people's use of technology, we need to address the desire first. Why are these students using ChatGPT? Why do they not want to do their own creative work? And that could be a whole nother podcast in and of itself on the education system and the pressures that students face, etc. That can be a whole nother thing. But it's just another example of the accountability that we need to take personally and collectively with the uses of these new technologies. You know, regulations and laws are great, but if you don't have people that are willing and ready to follow those regulations and rules, then that doesn't give those rules and regulations value. It doesn't give them power if nobody wants to adhere to them. And so I think a lot of these new emerging technologies need to start at the cultural level. It needs to start with conversations around how we can and should use it. And so I wonder how we could start talking about new technologies as or before they emerge into the public market. I don't know. No, it's part of what I'm doing with this podcast is to think about these things critically as they come up in popular media and social media, culturally, politically, etc. But we don't know what we don't know. So all we can do is theorize until these things come up. And that's okay. That's why eventually I'm not going to endorse VR right now. I could have put a affiliate link in the description for virtual reality headsets, but I haven't tried it yet myself. I don't want to endorse that yet until I take a look at and explore how people are using it and why and how should it be used. Then we can talk about it and have a good discussion about it before we start using it even more. Because you see these gamers on social media like Beat Saber. If you heard of that Beat Saber? Guitar Hero style VR. Looks really fun. I want to try it. But these people are spending hours on these virtual reality games. And it's not just VR, it's people spend hours on video games, PlayStations, Xbox, etc. They weren't ready for VR, and yet they jumped in and used it just as a transition, as a method to accomplish the same goal. What is that same goal in video games? Well, that could be another topic, but part of it could stem from wanting to escape the real world. That's partly why people use virtual reality. So, should we escape the real world? Well, maybe not for hours in a day, but how do you tell that? How do you regulate that? You have to self regulate. You have to take accountability for your personal use. And have the drive to improve your lives with the technology, not let it consume you. So that's my challenge to you all, is limit yourself. I know that's not necessarily a message that I tend to proclaim, because I myself don't let my limits often stop me from accomplishing what I want to accomplish, which is a great spirit and a great mindset, and it can be very beneficial. But there's a line between knowing your limits and acknowledging them and not letting them stop you. No, I have learned over time to acknowledge my limits for what they are, whether it be physical, mental, etc., and acknowledge and accept what's in my control and what is not in my control. Now, that's part of the serenity prayer, if you will, the serenity to accept the things you cannot change, the courage to change the things that you can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And that sentiment can be really powerful in all aspects of our lives, but even when it comes to new technological advancements, is what do you have control over? What are you willing to give up to technology? And what should you, not can, but what should you take accountability for? Now, one example of this could be, take a look at your screen time. How much social media are you using in a day? They're everywhere. There are billions of users in the world on these social media platforms per day. And it's astounding, it's amazing how many people are in this virtual world behind this bar of a phone or a computer or a tablet, and not socializing or interacting with people around us. And a lot of people are lonely because of that, but they use social media because they're lonely, because they want to socialize. And so it's a never ending cycle. So if we can break that cycle, and maybe we'll be a lot better off for it. So food for thought, y'all. Let's think about how we're using this technology and start talking about the should rather than the can. That's your daily thoughts for the day. So to conclude this episode, I want to make sure you go follow the Thinking Cat podcast. And again, we got YouTube, we'll be on Facebook, LinkedIn. We're no longer on TikTok. We want to make sure the Chinese don't take our information when it gets banned. And we're on Instagram as well. We are also posting these episodes on Rumble, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. You can also find me, Jack Timperley, on Jack Timperley Plus. I just renamed those social media accounts. Yeah, on YouTube, Facebook. You can find me on LinkedIn as well, Instagram, and we'll be posting clips of the Thinking Cat podcast, as well as my personal brand as Captain Marrow, professional superhero and comic book writer. We'll be posting clips of those on Jack Timperley Plus, and we'll continue to push out, share, like the Thinking Cat podcast episodes on YouTube, especially. Let's get this out there. If you leave a review on your podcast platform, you got Apple, Spotify, Google. If you leave a review, that will tell the algorithm to keep pushing out our content to more people. So leave a review, and that's going to be very important. Last but not least, make sure to order your thinking caps. They are now available on our website, jacktimperley.com/the thinking cap. Go get your thinking caps. And it's not just about thinking during this podcast, because it is. It's about going out into the world with your thinking cap on and thinking things through critically. The more you know, the more you think about, the more you know. The more you know, the more power you have over your own decisions and thoughts and actions. So thank you very much for listening and watching. Make sure you tune into the next episode, and we will see you all there.